Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K.Paul, HOD, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PhD coursework, welcome to my class. Today's lecture is on the topic Scope of Literature. Literature is a form of human expression, but not everything expressed in words, even when organized and written down, is counted as literature. Those writings that are primarily informative, technical, scholarly, journalistic would be excluded from the rank of literature by most, though not all, critics. Certain forms of writing, however, are universally regarded as belonging to literature as an art. Individual attempts within these forms are said to succeed if they possess something called artistic merit, and to fail if they do not. The nature of artistic merit is less easy to define than to recognize. The writer need not even pursue it to attain it. On the contrary, a scientific exposition might be of great literary value, and a pedestrian poem of none at all. The purest, or at least the most intense literary form, the purest, or at least the most intense literary form, is the lyric poem, and after it comes elegiac, epic, dramatic, narrative, and expository verse. Most theories of literary criticism base themselves on an analysis of poetry because the aesthetic problems of literature are there presented in their simplest and purest form. Poetry that fails as literature is not called poetry at all, but verse. Many novels, certainly all the world's great novels, are literature, but there are thousands that are not so considered. Most great dramas are considered literature, although the Chinese possessors of one of the world's greatest dramatic traditions consider their plays, with few exceptions, to possess no literary merit whatsoever. The Greeks thought of history as one of the seven arts, inspired by a goddess, the Muse Clio. All of the world's classic surveys of history can stand as noble examples of the art of literature, but most historical works and studies today are not written primarily with the literary excellence in mind, though they may possess it as it were by accident. Advertising. The essay was once written deliberately as a piece of literature. Its subject matter was a comparatively minor importance. Today, most essays are written as expository, informative journalism, although there are still essayists in the great tradition who think of themselves as artists. Now, as in the past, some of the greatest essayists are critics of literature, drama, and the arts. Some personal documents, autobiographies, diaries, memoirs, and letters rank among the world's greatest literature. Some examples of this biographical literature were written with posterity in mind, others with no thought of their being read by anyone but the writer. Some are in a highly polished literary style, others couched in a privately evolved language win their standing as literature because of their cogency, insight, depth, and scope. Many works of philosophy are classed as literature. The dialogues of Plato, 4th century BC, are written with a great narrative skill and in the finest prose. The meditations of the 2nd century Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius are a collection of apparently random thoughts, and the Greek in which they are written in is eccentric. Yet both are classed as literature, while the speculations of other philosophers, ancient and modern, are not. Certain scientific works endure as literature long after their scientific content has become outdated. This is particularly true of books of natural history, where the element of personal observation is of special importance. An excellent example is Gilbert White's Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne. Oratory, the art of persuasion, was long considered a great literary art. The oratory of the American Indian, for instance, is famous, while in classical Greece, Polymnia was the muse sacred to poetry and oratory. Rome's great orator Cicero was to have a decisive influence on the development of English prose style. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is known to every American school child today. However, oratory is more easily thought of as a craft than as an art. Most critics would not admit advertising, copywriting, a purely commercial fiction or cinema and television scripts as accepted forms of literary expression, although others would hotly dispute their exclusion. The test in individual cases would seem to be one of enduring satisfaction and of course truth. Indeed, it becomes more and more difficult to categorize literature. Most critics would not admit advertising, copywriting, purely commercial fiction, or cinema and television scripts as accepted forms of literary expression, although others would hotly dispute their exclusion. The test in individual cases would seem to be one of enduring satisfaction and, of course, truth. Indeed, it becomes more and more difficult to categorize literature or in modern civilization, words are everywhere. Man is subject to a continuous flood of communication. Most of it is fugitive, but here and there in high-level journalism, in television, in the cinema, in commercial fiction, in westerns and detective stories, and in plain expository prose, some writing almost by accident achieves an aesthetic satisfaction, a depth and relevance that entitle it to stand with other examples of the art of literature. Literary composition. Critical theories. If the early Egyptians or Sumerians had critical theories about the writing of literature, these have not survived. From the time of classical Greece until the present day, however, Western criticism has been dominated by two opposing theories of the literary art, which might conveniently be called the expressive and constructive theories of composition. The Greek philosopher and scholar Aristotle born 384 and died 322 BC. 384 to 322 BC is the first great representative of the constructive school of thought. His poetics, the surviving fragment of which is limited to an analysis of tragedy and epic poetry, has sometimes been dismissed as a recipe book for the writing of pot boilers. Certainly, Aristotle is primarily interested in the theoretical construction of tragedy, much as an architect might analyze the construction of a temple, but he is not exclusively objective and matter of fact. He does, however, regard the expressive elements in literature as of secondary importance, and the terms he uses to describe them have been open to interpretation and a matter of controversy ever since. The first century Greek treatise on the sublime, conventionally attributed to the third century Longinus, deals with the question left unanswered by Aristotle, what makes a great literature great? Its standards are almost entirely expressive, where Aristotle is analytical and states general principles. The pseudo Longinus is more specific and gives many quotations. Even so, his critical theories are confined largely to impressionistic generalities. Thus, at the beginning of Western literary criticism, the controversy already exists. Is the artist or writer a technician, like a cook or an engineer who designs and constructs a sort of machine that will elicit in an aesthetic response from his audience? Or is he a virtuoso who above all else expresses himself, and because he gives voice to the deepest realities of his own personality, generates a response from his readers because they admit some profound identification with him. This antithesis endures throughout Western European history. Scholasticism versus humanism, classicism versus romanticism, cubism versus expressionism, and survives to this day in the common judgment of our contemporary artists and writers. It is surprising how few critics have declared that the antithesis is unreal, that a work of literary or plastic art is at once constructive and expressive, and that it must in fact be both. Eastern critical theories of literature in the Orient, however, have been more varied. There is an immense amount of highly technical critical literature in India. Some works are recipe books, vast collections of tropes and stylistic devices. Others are philosophical and general. In the best period of Indian literature, the cultural climax of Sanskrit, 320 to 490. It is assumed by writers that expressive it is assumed by writers that expressive and constructive factors are twin aspects of one reality. The same could be said of the Chinese, whose literary manuals are books on prosody and rhetoric, are, as with the West, relegated to the class of technical handbooks, while their literary criticism is concerned rather with the subjective expressive factors, and so aligns itself with the pseudo Longinus sublime. In Japan, technical stylistic elements are certainly important. Japanese discrimination in these matters is perhaps the most refined in the world, but both writer and reader above all seek qualities of subtlety and poignancy, and look for intimations of profundity often so evanescent as to escape entirely the uninitiated reader. Broad and narrow conceptions of poetry. A far eastern literary tradition has raised the question of the broad and narrow definitions of poetry, a question familiar in the West from Edgar Allan Poe's advocacy of the short poem in his Poetic Principle, 1850. There are no long epic poems in Chinese, no verse novels of the sort written in England by Robert Browning or Alfred Lord Tennyson in the 19th century. In Chinese drama, apart from a very few of the songs, the verse as such is considered dogged. The versified treatises on astronomy, agriculture, or fishing of the sort written in Greek and Roman times and during the 18th century in the West are almost unknown in the Far East. Chinese poetry is almost exclusively lyric, meditative, and elegiac, and rarely does any poem exceed 100 lines. Most are little longer than Western sonnets. Many are only quatrains. In Japan, this tendency to limit length was carried even further. The ballads survives in folk poetry as it did in China, but the long poem of a very moderate length disappeared early from literature. For the Japanese, the tanka is a long poem. It is common it is a common form. It has 31 syllables. The sedoka has 38 lines. The dodo itsu, imitating folk song, has 26. From the 17th century and onward, the most popular poetic form was the haiku, which has only 17 syllables, 17 syllables. This development is relevant to the West because it spotlights the ever increasing emphasis which has been laid on intensity of communication, a characteristic of Western poetry and of literature generally. As it has evolved since the later 19th century, in the Far East, all cultivated people were supposed to be able to write suitable occasional poetry, and so those qualities that distinguished a poem from the mass consequently came to be valued above all others. Similarly, as modern readers in the West struggle with a communication avalanche of words, they seek in literature those forms, ideas, values, various experiences and styles. They transcend the verbiage to be had on every hand. Literary language in some literatures, notably classical Chinese, Old Norse, Old Irish, the language employed is quite different from that spoken or used in ordinary writing. This marks up the reading of literature as a special experience. In the Western tradition, it is only in comparatively modern times that literature has been written in the common speech of cultivated men. The Elizabethans did not talk like Shakespeare and not 18th century people in the stately prose of Samuel Johnson or Edward Gibbon. The so-called Augustan plain style in literature became popular in the later 17th century and flourished throughout the 18th. But it was really a special form of rhetoric with antecedent models in Greek and Latin. The first person to write major works of literature in the ordinary English language of the educated man was Daniel Defoe, 1660. to 1731, and it is remarkable how little the language has changed since. Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, is much more contemporary in tone than the elaborate prose of 19th century writers like Thomas De Quincey or Walter Pater. Defoe's language is not, in fact, so very simple. Simplicity is itself one form of artifice. Ambiguity. Other writers have sought to use language for its own subtle and complex effects and have deliberately cultivated the ambiguity inherent in the multiple or shaded meanings of words. Between the two through world wars, ambiguity became very fashionable in English and American poetry, and ferreting out of ambiguities from even the simplest poem was a favorite critical sport. T.S. Eliot, in his literary essays, is usually considered the founder of the movement. Actually, the platform of the critical attitudes is largely moral, but his two disciples, I.A. Richards in Principles of Literary Criticism and William Empson in Seven Types of Ambiguity, carried his method to extreme lengths. The basic document of the movement is Charles K. Ogden and I.A. Richards' The Meaning of Meaning, a work of enormous importance in its time. Only a generation later, however, their ideas were somewhat at a discount. Translation. Certainly, William Blake or Thomas Campion, when they were writing their simple lyrics, were unaware of the ambiguities and multiple meanings that future critics would find in them. Nevertheless, language is complex. Words do have overtones. They do stir up complicated reverberations in the mind that are ignored in their dictionary definitions. Great styles and most especially great poets work with at least a half-conscious or subliminal awareness of the infinite potentialities of language. This is one reason why the essence of most poetry and great prose is so resistant in translation, quite apart from the radically different sound patterns that are created in other language versions. The translator was project himself into the mind of the original author. He must transport himself into an entirely different world of relationships between sounds and meanings, and at the same time he must establish an equivalence between one infinitely complex system and another, since no two languages are truly equivalent in anything except the simplest terms. This is the most difficult accomplishment. Certain writers are exceptionally difficult to translate. There are no satisfactory English versions, for example, of the Latin of Tertullus, the French of Baudelaire, the Russian of Pushkin, or of the majority of Persian and Arabic poetry. The splendor of Sophocles' Greek, of Plato at his best, is barely suggested even in the finest English versions. On the other hand, the Germans insist that Shakespeare is better in German than he is in English, a humorous exaggeration perhaps, but again, Shakespeare is resistant to translation into French. His English seems to lack equivalents in that language. The very greatest translations may become may become classics in their own right of enduring literary excellence. The King James's version of the Bible, appearing in 1611, is the outstanding example. But on the whole, the approximate equivalence of most translations to their original seems to have a very short life. The original work remains the same of lasting value to its own people, but the translation becomes out of date with each succeeding generation as the language and criteria of literary taste change. Nothing demonstrates the complexity of literary language more vividly. An analogous process takes place when a reader experiences a literary work in his own language. Each generation gets a new version from its own classics. Yet the values of great literature are more fundamental than complexity and subtleties of meaning arising from the language alone. Works far removed from contemporary man in time and in cultural background composed in a variety of languages utterly different from one another in structure. Have nevertheless been translated translated successfully enough to be deeply moving. The 20th century has seen an immense mass of the oral literature of pre-literate peoples and of the writings of all great civilizations translated into modern languages. Understanding the growth of literature and its forms in other civilizations has greatly enriched the understanding of our own. Craftsmanship, prosody, literature like music is an art of time or tempo. It takes time to read or listen to, and it easily presents events or the development of ideas or the succession of images or all these together in time. The craft literature indeed can be said to be in part the manipulation of a structure in time, and so the simplest element of marking time rhythm is therefore of basic importance in both poetry and prosody, which is the science of versification, has for its subject the materials of poetry and is concerned almost entirely with the laws of meter, length, accent, and pitch of syllables, and the modifications of rhythm by vowels and consonants. In most poetry, certain basic rhythms are repeated with modifications, that is to say, the poem rhymes or scans or both, but not in all. It most obviously does neither in the case of the free forms of modern poetry, but neither does it in the entire poetry of whole cultures, since lyric poetry is either the actual text of song or else is immediately derived from song. It is regular in structure nearly everywhere in the world, although the elements of patterning that go into producing its rhythm may vary. The most important of these elements in English poetry, for example, have been accent, a grouping of syllables called feet, a number of syllables in the line, and rhyme at the end of a line and sometimes within it. Other elements such as pitch, resonance, repetition of vowels, assonance, repetition of consonants, alliteration, and breath pauses, cadence have also been of great importance in distinguishing successful poetry from doggerel verse, but on the whole they are not as important as the former, and poets have not always been fully conscious of syllables, long or short. rather than on their accent, but all the considerations of sound, such as assonance and alliteration, entered into the aesthetically satisfactory structure of a poem. Similarly, both the French and Japanese were content simply to count the syllables in a line, but again they also looked to all the sound elements. The rhythms of prose are more complicated, though not necessarily more complex than those of poetry. The rules of prose patterning are less fixed patterns evolve and shift indefinitely and are seldom repeated except for a special emphasis. So the analysis of prose rhythm is more difficult to make than at least the superficial analysis of poetry. Structure. The craft of writing involves more than mere rules of prosody. The work's structure must be manipulated to attract the reader. First, the literary situation has to be established. The reader must be directly related to the work placed in it, given enough information on who, what, when, or why, so that his attention is caught and held, or on the other hand, he must be deliberately mystified to the same end. Aristotle gave a formula for dramatic structure that can be generalized to apply to most literature: presentation, development, complication, crisis, and resolution. Even lyric poems can possess plot in this sense, but by no means are all literary works so structured, nor does such structure ensure their merit. It can be safely and said that westerns, detective stories, and cheap melodramas are more likely to follow strictly the rules of Aristotle's poetics than are great novels. Nevertheless, the scheme does provide a norm from which there is infinite variation. Neoclassical dramatists and critics, especially in 17th century France, derived from Aristotle what they call the unities of time, action, and place. This meant that the action of a play should not spread beyond the events of one day, and best of all, should be confined within the actual time of performance, nor should the action move about too much from place to place, based only to go from indoors to outdoors and back. There should be only one plot line which might be relieved by a subplot, usually comic. These three unities of time, place, and action do not occur in Aristotle and are certainly not observed in classical Greek tragedy. They are invention of Renaissance critics, some of whom went even further, insisting also on what might be called a unity of mood. To this day, there are those who, working on this principle, object to Shakespeare's use of comic relief within the tragic action of his plays. To the porter in Macbeth, for instance, or the grave diggers in Hamlet. Assiduous critics have found elaborate architectural structures in quite diffuse works, including Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, written in Quixote, written between 1605 and 1615. Stern's Tristram Shandy, 1759-1766. Casanova's Ico Samaron, 1788 and 1928. But their discoveries are too often put there after the event. Great early novels such as The Chinese Dream of the Red Chamber, first published in English in 1929, and the Japanese tale of Genji, early 11th century, usually developed organically rather than according to geometrical formulas, one incident or image spinning off another. Probably the most tightly structured work in the neoclassicist sense is the Icelandic Njal's saga. The 19th century was the golden age of the novel, and most of the more famous examples of the form are very systematically plotted, even where the plot structure simply traces the growth in personality of an individual hero or heroine. This kind of novel, of which in their very diverse ways, Stendhal's The Red and the Black, published in 1830, and Dickens's David Copperfield, published in 1850, are great examples, is known as Bildungsroman. Gustav Flauber's Madame Bovary, published in 1857, is a rigorously classicist in form as the 17th century plays of Racine and Corneille, which were the high point of the French classical theatre. Although Flaubert obeys laws more complex than those of the Aristotelians, novels such as Tolstoy's War and Peace, 1865 to 1869, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, 1880, and the works of Balzac owe much of their power to their ability to overwhelm the reader with a massive sense of reality. The latter 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed an attack on old forms, but what the new writers evolved was simply a new architecture. A novel like James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, which takes place in the day and an evening, is one of the most structured ever written. Novelists such as Joseph Conrad, Ford Maddox, Ford, Virginia Woolf, and to a lesser extent Henry James developed a multiple aspect narrative, sometimes by using time shifts and flashbacks, and by writing from different points of view, sometimes by using the device dating back to classical Greek romances of having one or more narrators as characters within the story. This technique, which was first perfected in the verse novels of Robert Browning, in fact reached its most extreme development in the English language in poetry, in Ezra Pound's cantos, T.S. Eliot's The West Land, William Carlos Williams's Patterson, and the many long poems influenced by them. The literature review analyzes relationships and connections among different works. This differs from an annotated bibliography, which provides a list and a brief description of articles, books, theses, and other documents. The literature review should not merely list and summarize one piece of research after another. Though analysis of major works and subsequent scholarship, the literary review lays out the evolution of scholarship on a topic and establishes a context for further research. This will help you to establish why the topic is important and place your research in a theoretical context. A literature review will help us to avoid redundancy in our own research, and to identify their problems, possibilities for their research, and to expand upon or ask new questions. The literature review allows us as a researcher to enter into an ongoing conversation with other scholars and researchers. A literature review may be comprehensive or selective but should examine a seminal or principal works and works that have been consequential in the field. The scope of a literature review will vary by assignment and discipline. The literature review may be part of a larger work of or a stand-alone article, meaning that it is the entirety of a paper. The literature review may be part of the introduction or a separate section to a thesis, dissertation, or research report, setting up the context for the author's original research. The literary review compares and contrasts, identifies areas of consensus and dissent, reveals gaps and oversights, indicates areas needing further research, points our trends, themes, approaches, methodologies, theories, and frames of analysis, discusses major debates in the field, examines methodological or theoretical strengths and weaknesses. Literature as an ordinary word, as hinted in the beginning, literature in its ordinary sense refers to any word, phrase, or sentence written or spoken. It can be a piece of information on a particular subject or field of knowledge. Examples are demand and supply as part of economic literature, colonialism and imperialism as part of political science literature, editor and sub-editor as part of journalism literature, lawyer and judge as part of legal literature. Etymologically, literature comes from the French word literature, which is also derived from the Latin word literatura, with the following meanings: alphabet, system of letters, writing, and scholarship. Grammatically, literature is a noun, as in African literature. In this example, African is an adjective qualifying the noun literature. However, depending on the context, it is significant to mention that the definition of literature varies from scholar to scholar, from environment to environment, from context to context, but one thing is common to all definitions: quality of creative imagination. This implies that every literary work must have an exceptional imaginative value. This way, my dear students, I have completed my lecture. The lecture is over. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.